Welcome to the deep dive. You know, the material you sent over this week, it really got me thinking, especially that Samara piece on crafting more realistic AI personas.
Hmm.
And then there's your own experience, right? Using Grain and Rally, building that digital twin, the one that seemed to just know it nailed that big career decision. Still kind of blows my mind.
It really does raise some fundamental questions, doesn't it? I mean, here we have these really sophisticated language models,
Yeah.
and they're increasingly being used to simulate how people think, how they behave,
Hmm.
especially in areas like, say, market research,
Hmm.
predicting survey responses,
Right.
and the whole idea of tapping into this, virtual population to quickly gauge public opinion. It's incredibly appealing.
Okay, so let's dig into this a bit. The potential is, well, it feels like this amazing shortcut, right, to understanding what people believe, what they might do.
Exactly.
But like Samara's article points out, these LLMs, they don't have a perfect record, not when it comes to representing everyone accurately.
No, they don't.
And that's really the core of our deep dive today, isn't it? How well can AI really understand and represent different groups? And maybe more importantly, which groups are getting misrepresented or maybe just overlooked?
Precisely. The central question for you, and really for anyone thinking about using these simulations, is can we actually rely on AI to mirror that whole diverse range of opinions and behaviors you find in, a real population?
Mm-hmm.
Samara's research, and it's backed up by various studies, it shows some pretty significant limitations. It's not like a uniform level of understanding across the board.
Okay.
Some demographic groups just consistently seem to pose more challenges for these models.
So who are we talking about? Who are these groups that AI simulations consistently, well, struggle with? The article gives a pretty detailed list. Maybe start with older adults. It seems LLMs often get their perspectives wrong, quite wrong sometimes.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the pattern you see. It's not just one study.
Yeah.
A U.S. study looked at, I think, 60 demographic segments.
Wow, 60.
Yeah. And it found older adults, say 65 plus, they weren't well represented. And this wasn't just a U.S. thing either. Data from Chile showed the same thing. Accuracy dropped when simulating seniors.
Huh.
It suggests there might be something fundamental maybe in how LLMs process language or viewpoints linked with older age, possibly across cultures.
That could have really big implications, couldn't it? If we're using AI to understand things like, I don't know, healthcare needs or retirement planning for this group.
Absolutely. How badly could that misrepresentation skew things?
Yeah.
Could lead to really flawed policies.
It's a really important point. Yeah.
Mm.
If the AI is getting a big chunk of the population wrong, the insights, well, they're just not reliable.
Right.
What about women? The article suggested that's maybe a bit more complex.
It is, yeah. So in Chile, research using the llama model, it showed this distinct bias. Women's responses were simulated less accurately than men's.
Okay.
But interestingly, a simpler model didn't show that same gap, which kind of suggests the more advanced LLM itself might be introducing some kind of bias.
Hmm.
Now, in the U.S., the overall performance for men and women might look similar on the surface, but when you start looking at the intersections,
Oh.
certain groups of women, like non-white women, or women with more left-leaning political views, they were significantly underrepresented. The models seem to struggle with that specific combination of traits.
So it's like the training data just doesn't fully capture the sheer variety of experiences and viewpoints women have, especially when other identities come into play.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It feels like the AI might be working with certain built-in assumptions, or maybe the data it learned from just isn't diverse enough.
And this issue, it sounds like it gets even more pronounced when we talk about racial and ethnic minorities.
Absolutely. That U.S. study you mentioned,
Yeah.
it found race was a huge factor in prediction accuracy. Much bigger errors when simulating non-white groups.
Right.
And then you have tools like the bias lens benchmark, which is basically designed to stress test AI models for bias across different scenarios, different social identities. Bias lens really highlights this. It found that roles defined by race or culture, they triggered the most biased kind of stereotype responses across multiple LLMs.
So the worry is the models might just default to majority group norms or lean on really simplistic stereotypes when trying to represent these communities.
Exactly. That's a real concern.
Which brings us to another really key factor, socioeconomic status. It
Right.
sounds like lower education levels, lower income, AI accuracy drops there too.
Precisely. The data we have, both from the U.S. and Chile, it points that way.
Yeah.
Lower accuracy for personas with less education. And the Chilean research specifically mentioned worse performance for lower social classes.
Mm.
In the U.S., yeah, a big drop in accuracy for lower-income individuals. It probably links back to differences in, language use, the kind of online content people engage with.
And just how much they're represented in the training data in the first place.
Exactly. It's like trying to learn a language just from reading academic papers. You'd miss out on a lot of everyday conversation,
Right.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense. But it's not just about demographics like age, gender, race, is it? The article also talked about political views, especially people in the center or those with kind of mixed ideologies.
This is a really fascinating point. It seems the models are actually better at mimicking strong partisans, people with very clear left or right ideologies.
Okay.
But individuals who see themselves as centrist or politically neutral, they're less well represented. The models might give less consistent answers for them.
Huh.
And similarly, if you have someone with like cross-cutting beliefs, maybe someone very religious but also holding left-wing views, the accuracy tends to drop.
It's almost like the models expect people to fit into neat boxes, belief-wise, and they struggle with the nuance and complexity that's, well, pretty common in real people.
I think that's right. Those strong, clear viewpoints are probably just easier to find and learn from than the huge amounts of text data. They're louder, maybe.
That makes a certain kind of sense, yeah. What about religious minorities? Similar challenges there.
The Chilean data suggests so.
Yeah.
Just having a religious affiliation, generally, was linked to lower simulation accuracy.
Okay.
And the most striking finding, a near total failure to accurately simulate older, low-educated religious women.
Wow. Near total failure.
Yeah. It really highlights how these underrepresentation issues can just stack up, right?
Yeah.
When multiple identity factors intersect. That specific finding is, well, it's genuinely concerning, thinking about how AI tools might misunderstand the needs of a really significant, often vulnerable group.
It's a really sobering reminder, isn't it? Just how complex human identity is and how far AI still has to go to really get it.
Mm.
And I guess this whole problem gets even bigger when we step outside Western cultures, especially that heavy focus on the U.S. context.
Oh, absolutely. That bias towards Western and particularly American data, it's a really consistent pattern. The study comparing U.S. and Chilean survey simulations found much better performance on the U.S. responses.
Even after adjusting for how hard the questions were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even after accounting for that, the researchers directly pointed to the U.S.-centric nature of the training data.
So if you're trying to understand opinions in, say, non-English speaking countries or the global South, you need to be even more careful about accuracy.
Definitely. Exercise much greater caution.
Yeah.
The models just haven't been trained as deeply on those diverse cultural contexts. Simple as that.
Okay, so we have a clearer picture of who is often left out or misrepresented. Now let's get into the why. Why are these gaps happening? The article points to a few key reasons, starting with the training data itself. Imbalances there.
Yeah, this is really foundational. LLMs learn from these massive text data sets, right? But that data isn't a perfect reflection of the world's demographics, not even close.
Right.
Online content, for example, it tends to skew younger, English-speaking, Western, male. So naturally, the models get better at understanding and copying those perspectives.
Like you said, the better performance on U.S. data comes straight from that U.S.-centric training.
Exactly. If certain groups just have a smaller digital footprint, their nuances, their specific viewpoints, they're just less likely to be fully captured. Think of it like learning about a city only by reading its official tourism brochures. You miss a lot.
Yeah, okay. That makes intuitive sense. It's a what you put in is what you get out kind of thing. Partly, anyway.
Right.
But it's not just the raw data, is it? The way the models are fine-tuned, alignment, RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback, that plays a big role too.
It absolutely does. Alignment aims to make models safer, more helpful, right?
Yeah.
Which is good, but it can accidentally bring in its own biases.
How so?
Well, the people giving the feedback, the guidelines they use, they often reflect certain norms, maybe more mainstream views. So RLHF can actually steer models towards reflecting, say, more liberal, well-educated perspectives.
Regardless of the persona they're supposed to be mimicking.
Sometimes, yeah. And it can end up sort of softening or even suppressing opinions that are more extreme or controversial, even if those opinions are genuinely held by some people. The article mentioned one case where a model showed over 99% approval for a political figure, which is just unrealistic.
Right. It's like the models are being nudged towards a generally acceptable middle ground, even if reality is messier.
Pretty much.
And then there's the issue of how the models actually process demographic info, biases in modeling interactions, the article called it.
This is where the sheer complexity of human identity becomes a real hurdle. LLMs are great at finding correlations in data, but they can struggle with how different traits connect and interact.
So they might treat age, race, gender as separate boxes, not seeing how they weave together.
Exactly. Instead of understanding how those things interact to shape someone's actual lived experience. And the result can be a persona that feels stereotypical or maybe inconsistent because the model hasn't grasped that nuanced interplay.
Real people have these complex interactions, right? Like how education affects your views might depend hugely on your age or where you live.
Precisely. And if the training data doesn't cover enough of those combinations, the simulations just won't be accurate.
So it's not just if data exists for a group, but how the model understands the connections between different groups.
Okay. And the last piece of the why puzzle,
Yeah,
content filtering and self-censorship.
right. Those filters designed to stop harmful or toxic output. They're necessary, but they can also accidentally clamp down on authentic expression from certain groups.
Especially groups that might use stronger language or talk about taboo topics.
Exactly. If the safety filters are too aggressive about blocking anything negative or profane or politically charged, then a simulated persona from one of those groups might just sound unnaturally tame, less real.
It's a tricky balance then. Safety versus realistic representation.
A very delicate balance. It sounds like there's this real tension. Aiming for alignment, safe, broadly acceptable AI versus achieving realism, reflecting the sometimes messy, uncomfortable reality of human opinions. The article mentioned what happens when you dial back those filters.
Yeah, what's really interesting there is comparing the base models, the ones just trained on raw internet data, with the models that have gone through RLHF alignment.
Okay.
Research suggests those base models tend to lean more towards the views of, say, less educated, lower income, more conservative groups, which makes sense given the raw data.
Right.
Then you apply the human feedback alignment, and the models shift. They start reflecting more liberal, higher educated viewpoints.
So neither one is a perfect mirror of the whole population.
Not at all. But it really shows how the alignment process itself steers the bias in a particular direction. The article even mentioned an experiment where loosening the filters on ChatGPT led it to give a factually wrong answer, but one that was very much aligned with a specific partisan viewpoint. It wasn't aligned in the safety sense, but it was arguably more realistic for that specific persona.
Wow. Okay. So given all these challenges, all these potential pitfalls, what can people actually do? Researchers or anyone using these AI personas, how can they make them more realistic and, importantly, less biased? The article had some practical suggestions.
Yeah, and these are really crucial things to think about. One big one is just enriching the prompts you use to create the persona.
So not just 45-year-old rural voter.
Exactly. Go way beyond that. Give much more context. Their background, education, hobbies, maybe even contradictory beliefs they hold.
Like their upbringing, where they get their news, who they hang out with.
All of that. Anything that adds layers, nuance, complexity, get away from those flat, simple demographic labels to avoid stereotypes.
Okay, paint a richer picture in the prompt itself. What about leveraging belief networks or anchoring opinions? What's that about?
It's a pretty clever technique, actually. Instead of just listing demographics, you start by anchoring the persona with one strong belief on a specific issue.
Okay.
Because LLMs have learned how beliefs tend to cluster together in the real world, that initial anchor can help the model generate more consistent, more human-like opinions on related topics.
So instead of just religious person, you might say, this person deeply believes in community-based support.
Exactly. That core belief can then guide its responses on other things in a more realistic, internally consistent way.
That makes a lot of sense, giving it a foundation, not just a label. Another technique was few-shot prompting with real examples.
Yeah, this is more direct. If you happen to have actual survey answers or quotes from people in your target group,
You put them right in the prompt.
you put a few examples right in the prompt. It gives the model concrete examples of the language, the tone, the key concerns for that group. It helps it mimic those patterns much better than just relying on its general training.
Like a mini training set within the prompt. Got it. And what about getting more variety within a group? Adjusting sampling and creativity settings.
Right, the temperature setting, you see that in lots of LLM interfaces, it controls randomness. Cranking it up a little bit can introduce more variability, a wider range of plausible opinions. which is more like a real group of people, right? Not everyone thinks exactly alike.
Makes sense. More diversity within the simulation.
Yeah, and other things like nucleus sampling can allow for more unexpected word choices, making the personas feel less like clones and more like individuals.
Interesting. Another point was deliberately incorporating uncertainty or ambivalence.
Yeah, because real people are often unsure. We have mixed feelings. We haven't made up our minds on everything.
But LLMs might just give confident answers all the time.
They often do, yeah, because they learn from text that's usually written with confidence. So explicitly telling the persona to express doubt or conflicting thoughts, maybe using phrases like, well, I'm not totally sure, or, there are arguments both ways. They can make the simulation feel much more authentic.
Reflecting real human indecision. Okay. And for the more technical folks, targeted fine-tuning and retrieval augmentation.
Right. These are more involved, but can be really effective for tricky, underrepresented groups. Fine-tuning means training the LLM more on a specific data set relevant to that group, like transcripts from focus groups with them.
Giving it specialized knowledge.
Exactly. And retrieval augmentation, or IA, means feeding the model relevant real-world info, stats, news, cultural context while it's generating the response. It helps ground the output in facts and specific knowledge about that group.
Okay. And finally, crucially, treating the AI output as a first draft. Checking for bias, refining things.
Absolutely crucial. Don't just take the first answer and run with it. Actively look for stereotypes, generic responses, things that just don't fit the persona you're aiming for.
And maybe get feedback from actual people in that group.
That's incredibly valuable, yeah. They can spot where the simulation feels off, where it needs tweaking. It's really an iterative process. Prompt, evaluate, refine, repeat. Especially if you're trying to simulate marginalized groups without heavy filters. You need checks for harmful content too.
This really brings us full circle, back to your digital twin experience, that correct decision it made.
Yeah.
But now, thinking about all this, you have to wonder, right? Was that decision truly based on a deep understanding of you, your specific history, your motivations?
Yeah. Or was it maybe influenced more by broader patterns in the data it learned from? Patterns linked to the kind of person who makes that choice. Maybe a demographic that's just better represented in its training.
Or even just the way it was prompted.
Exactly. It really hammers home the need to stay critical, doesn't it?
Uh,
To be aware of those potential underlying biases, even when the output seems spot on.
So wrapping this up then, the big takeaway seems to be LLMs. Incredible potential for understanding people, gaining insights, huge promise.
No doubt.
But
Yeah.
we absolutely have to acknowledge they have significant blind spots right now. Certain groups are consistently underrepresented, misrepresented, and we have to keep that front of mind whenever we use or even just see AI-generated info about different populations.
Exactly. Approach it with enthusiasm, yes, but also a really healthy dose of skepticism about the current limits,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to capturing the full, messy, wonderful diversity of human experience. These are powerful tools, no question. But their accuracy is shaped by the data they eat and how they're built.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought, I guess.
Yeah.
Given these challenges, these difficulties in representing everyone fairly, how do we make sure AI actually becomes a tool for greater understanding, for inclusivity, instead of just accidentally baking in and amplifying the biases we already have in society? What's our responsibility here? As users, creators, even just observers of this tech, how do we push for a more nuanced, more accurate AI reflection of the world? Definitely something to chew on.
Thanks. This was a really fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure. Always good to talk through it.
Step into the simulation, a virtual audience of role-playing characters, each with a unique perspective. This is more than playful fantasy. Welcome to Rally, a private crowd feedback platform designed to offer swift, authentic insights. Within these digital personas, you can pose nearly any question. Is your marketing pitch resonating? Does your design spark delight? Here you receive direct, honest feedback, free of the echo chamber and groupthink often found elsewhere. Marketers validate campaigns before launch. Innovators refine product concepts. Entrepreneurs test prototypes across broad or niche specific digital audiences, all in a safe and private environment. Rally's simulated panel never tires and remains ready to guide you toward sharper, everyday decisions. By combining simplicity with insights from the crowd, Rally removes the barriers between your questions and your answers. All the wisdom, none of the scars.